Get your hands off her! What in the world are you doing?" The moment I heard my daughter's muffled scream, I dashed across the lawn faster than I'd ever moved in my life, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. My 13-year-old Sarah had tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to hold on to the arms of her wheelchair. Standing behind her was a woman I recognized from the neighborhood, a woman who called herself Karen, even though that might not have been her real name. Clutching a fistful of Sarah's hair, the sight made me see red, and I barked out another warning. "Let her go, right now!" Karen slowly released Sarah's hair, with an air of exasperation, as though she'd done nothing more than brush off a pesky insect. Sarah trembled, half sobbing, half gasping for air. Her legs, weakened by cerebral palsy, couldn't support her even if she'd tried to stand. In that instant I wanted to shout, to pull Karen away by force, but I held back. Sarah was in distress, and I needed to ensure she was okay first. I bent down, checking my daughter's scalp for any sign of bleeding or injury. She shook in my arms, eyes wide with fear. Karen flipped her hair over her shoulder, glaring at us both. "She's been rolling that thing all over the neighborhood sidewalks," she snapped, voice trembling with unspent rage. "We have rules here, HOA guidelines, and I've told you people 1,000 times that you can't leave your wheelchair ramps just anywhere or block the walkways with special equipment." Her tone seethed with a sense of entitlement so thick I could almost taste it. Sarah had never blocked any walkway. She used the ramp we installed at our front steps, and occasionally she rolled down the sidewalk in front of our house to get a bit of fresh air. It was hardly an inconvenience to anyone, but Karen had made it her personal mission to pick fights over the smallest perceived infractions. I forced my shaking hands to remain steady as I eased Sarah's wheelchair back into position. The tears shimmering in her eyes fueled my anger. "You're out of line," I said to Karen, trying to keep my voice measured. "Pulling a disabled child's hair isn't just rude, it's assault. If you have a problem, you come to me. You don't hurt my daughter." She scoffed, crossing her arms so tightly I thought she'd cut off her own circulation. "Then keep your daughter off the community sidewalks," she spat. "I've seen her out here, rolling around like she owns the place. This is a neighborhood with standards. If you can't respect that, maybe you should move." She spun around, tossed me one more venomous look, and marched away. Sarah began to sob quietly. My heart shattered. I knelt beside her, wiping away the tears that clung to her cheeks. "It's okay," I whispered. "You did nothing wrong. She's just a bad person." Sarah nodded, but didn't look convinced. By now, a couple of neighbors peered out their windows. They had probably heard the commotion. I had too much adrenaline flooding my system to care who was watching. My priority was getting Sarah inside, making sure she felt safe, and checking that no real harm had been done. As soon as we reached the living room, I helped her onto the couch and asked if she felt any pain in her scalp or neck. She sniffled, running a hand over the spot where Karen had pulled her hair. "It stings," she said shakily, "but I'm more scared than anything." I brought her a glass of water, handed her a stuffed unicorn she loved, and assured her that everything would be all right. Truth was, my mind was a storm of anger and uncertainty. The image of Karen yanking Sarah's hair played over and over. I'd dealt with that woman's rude letters and snide remarks before, but never in my wildest dreams did I imagine she would resort to physically attacking a child. My wife, Teresa, had been out running errands. The moment she got home and saw Sarah's red eyes, she demanded an explanation. Sarah tried to speak, but she started crying again, so I filled my wife in, recounting every awful detail. Teresa's face drained of color. "She actually pulled Sarah's hair?" she asked in a trembling whisper. I knew Karen was nasty, but that's a new low. While we comforted Sarah, I couldn't help but notice the fear creeping into Teresa's expression. She'd grown up in neighborhoods with active, sometimes militant HOAs, and Karen's petty harassment had been ramping up for months. Now, it had become outright violence. "We can't let her get away with this," Teresa said, gripping my hand. "We have to call the police." I exhaled slowly. That was precisely what I was thinking. Hurting a disabled minor was no minor infraction. It was a serious offense. The only hesitation I had was that, in the past, the local police had been less than enthusiastic about intervening in HOA disputes. Some officers seemed to think these were simply neighborly spats, but Karen had crossed a line this time, and I intended to make that clear. I helped Sarah calm down, turned on her favorite TV show, and told Teresa to watch over her while I made the call. The operator sounded sympathetic enough when I explained that a neighbor physically assaulted my daughter, but her tone shifted slightly when I mentioned it was an altercation with an HOA official. She assured me someone would come by to take a report. An hour later, a patrol car rolled up to our driveway. A young officer stepped out. From the look in his eyes, I could tell he thought this was going to be a typical neighbor dispute. He asked me for a quick rundown, took notes, and then asked for Sarah's statement. She tried her best to explain how Karen had yanked her hair for no reason, though her voice faltered at times from nerves. Afterward, the officer sighed. "I can file a report," he said, "but have you spoken to your HOA board about this? Maybe they can handle it internally." My frustration spiked. "This isn't an internal HOA matter," I snapped. "She assaulted my daughter. She grabbed her hair. She caused her physical pain. My daughter is disabled and can't defend herself." The officer nodded, though the doubt didn't leave his eyes. "I understand," he responded, "but the local DA might want more evidence than just statements. Do you have any video footage, any witnesses who saw her do it?" I clenched my jaw. As far as I knew, no one had caught it on camera. Most neighbors kept their heads down whenever Karen's name got involved. "We'll try to see if any neighbors might have security cameras," I said. "Meanwhile, can we at least file a charge or something official? We can't let her think this is okay." The officer promised to document the incident and left shortly afterward, though I sensed it wouldn't lead to immediate action. Teresa hugged Sarah while I paced the living room, trying to figure out our next move. "We should talk to your dad," she said suddenly. "He'll know what to do." At first, my mind blanked. Then I remembered who my father was. A law enforcement officer with nearly 3 decades of experience, the kind of man who had cultivated a reputation for being a straight shooter. He was near retirement now, but he still carried his badge, still had connections, still knew how to navigate the complexities of local policing. My father had been away on a brief fishing trip, but I decided to call him. Maybe he'd have insight into how to make sure the authorities took Karen's assault seriously. By the time Dad returned my call that evening, Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch. He listened quietly as I poured out the details. Karen, the hair-pulling, the officer's lukewarm response. Dad's voice grew tight with anger. "That's assault on a minor with a disability," he said, enunciating each word with the precision of someone who'd read 1,000 case files. "I'll drive over tomorrow. We'll go down to the precinct together and see what we can do." He didn't need to say more. I already felt relief washing through me. Dad might have been nearing retirement, but his badge still held weight in this county. He wasn't going to let a bully walk free. The next morning, Sarah was calmer, though still jumpy. She flinched at sudden noises, her eyes darting to the window as though Karen might burst in at any second. Teresa stayed home from work to support her. I made breakfast, trying to mask my simmering rage. Dad pulled into our driveway around 9. He stepped out of his truck looking every bit the seasoned officer he was. Tall, broad shoulders, hair mostly silver but still cropped in a neat style. He gave Sarah a gentle hug before turning to me. "Let's go," he said. "I want to speak with the officer who took your report." We drove to the local station. Dad's presence changed the atmosphere the moment we walked in. The desk clerk recognized him immediately. "Good to see you, Lieutenant," she said, trying to conceal her surprise at his sudden appearance. Dad nodded politely. "We're here about an assault on my granddaughter. Can you direct us to the officer in charge of the case?" Within minutes, the same officer who had visited our house emerged, looking slightly uncomfortable now that my father stood beside me. Dad introduced himself, showed his badge from the county sheriff's department, the department he had served before taking a position at a specialized state task force. The shift in attitude was palpable. The officer straightened, cleared his throat, and invited us into a small office. "I appreciate your time," Dad said, "but we need to talk about the seriousness of what happened. My granddaughter, who uses a wheelchair due to a permanent condition, was physically assaulted." "That's not just a minor dispute," the officer swallowed, nodding more vigorously than the day before. "Sir, I understand. I took the statements, but we have to follow procedure. If there's no video footage and no neutral witnesses, the suspect can claim it didn't happen that way. It becomes a he said, she said scenario." My father pressed his lips together. "You took photos of any marks on my granddaughter's head?" The officer admitted there hadn't been visible scratches. I jumped in. "Karen yanked her hair. That doesn't always leave a bruise or scratch, but it's still assault." Dad placed a hand on my shoulder as if to calm me down, but I could hear tension in his voice when he spoke again. "We need an official interview with the suspect, and we need to keep this on file, not just as a note that might get lost. She may have a history of harassment we can document." After nearly an hour of back and forth, the officer agreed to escalate the report, at least to the point of calling Karen in for questioning. Dad also requested they check if any other neighbors had lodged complaints about her. We left the station with an undercurrent of determination swirling around us. Dad's badge had made some difference, but we both knew we'd have to keep pushing. When we arrived back at my home, we found Teresa and Sarah anxiously waiting. Sarah looked relieved to see her grandfather. He knelt beside her chair, took her hand, and said gently, "We're going to handle this." She managed a weak smile, but her eyes remained tinged with fear. Dad asked if we'd mind if he took a look around the neighborhood. I understood he wanted to scout out any possible security cameras or potential witnesses. We agreed, and off he went, strolling down the sidewalk as if on a leisurely walk. But I knew he was in investigation mode. Less than 20 minutes later, he returned with interesting news. An elderly neighbor at the end of the street, Mrs. Henderson, had a security camera that pointed toward the sidewalk in front of her home. Dad believed it might have captured something. We hurried over to Mrs. Henderson's place. It turned out she was quite friendly and more than willing to help once she heard about the assault on Sarah. She opened up her camera footage for us to skim through. At first, it mostly showed passing cars, a couple walking their dog, some kids on bikes. Then, at a certain point in the video, we spotted Sarah rolling along in her wheelchair, minding her own business, heading back toward our house. Moments later, Karen's figure marched into frame, her posture aggressive as she approached from behind. Her hand shot out, clearly grabbing Sarah's hair. It was a bit grainy, but there was no doubt about the motion. Hair yanking. Then the camera angle shifted slightly as they moved past the field of view, but we had enough to confirm that Karen physically reached out and pulled my daughter's hair. Watching it made my blood boil again. Dad swore under his breath. Mrs. Henderson's face paled. "That's awful," she said, shaking her head. "I always thought that woman was too domineering. I never would have guessed she'd do something like that." We thanked her profusely for letting us see the footage and requested a copy. She agreed, apologizing that her camera angle didn't catch the rest of the incident, but it was enough. Armed with this new evidence, Dad and I returned to the station. The officer we'd spoken to earlier hadn't left for the day yet. His eyes widened when we showed him the snippet. "That changes things," he said. "There's clear physical contact here, and it aligns with your daughter's statement. We can try to bring her in for further questioning, maybe even file charges of assault on a minor." My father nodded. "Yes, that's exactly what we want. We're not looking for revenge, but there must be accountability." That evening, the officer called me to confirm they had scheduled an interview with Karen for the following morning. When I told Teresa and Sarah, they both looked relieved. Sarah still had nightmares about the incident. She'd wake up in the middle of the night whimpering that Karen was chasing her. We tried to reassure her, but fear is not so easily dispelled. I was just grateful that Dad was around. His presence alone gave us a sense of security. I should have known, however, that Karen wouldn't go quietly. The next morning, bright and early, she banged on our front door. I opened it to see her face contorted with fury, holding a piece of paper that I recognized as one of those HOA violation notices. She shoved it at me, nearly hitting me in the chest. "You want to accuse me of assault?" she hissed. "Well, guess what? Your daughter's wheelchair ramp, the portable one you sometimes place on the curb, is in violation of the association's aesthetic policy. You're facing daily fines. And I'm going to make sure it sticks." For a second, I was too stunned to speak. Then anger surged. "This is retaliation," I said through gritted teeth. "You assaulted my child, and now you're trying to punish us through the HOA? That's not just unethical, it's harassment." Karen gave a mocking laugh. "Harassment? Don't be ridiculous. You can't prove that's why you're being fined. The ramp is an eyesore, and I have every right to enforce the rules. By the time the HOA is done with you, you'll wish you never lived in this neighborhood." She turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving me shaking with rage. Inside, Dad listened as I recounted her latest stunt. He sighed, clearly disgusted. "People like her should never be given a scrap of authority," he muttered. "Her day's coming, just keep that ramp properly documented. Your daughter's disability is protected under the ADA. The HOA can't just override federal law." Teresa joined us in the living room, looking worried. "She might try to rally the entire board against us," she said. "They've been known to close ranks. Half the neighbors are afraid to speak up, or they support her because she's so forceful." Dad squared his shoulders. "Then we'll have to fight back with facts and the law. The police have that footage now. If they do their job, Karen's in hot water." Sure enough, about an hour later, the officer called to let me know Karen had been brought in for questioning, but she denied everything, claimed Sarah had gotten her wheelchair stuck on some loose gravel in front of Karen's yard, and that Karen was helping by pushing her forward. According to Karen, Sarah's hair got caught on her wristwatch by accident. When the officer brought up the security footage, she insisted the angle was misleading. "She's obviously lying," I fumed to Dad. He nodded. "But this is what suspects do when confronted. The footage is pretty clear, though. Let's hope the DA sees it that way, too." Teresa had to go into work for a few hours, so Dad and I stayed home with Sarah. We tried to keep her mind off of the drama by engaging in some fun activities, board games, painting, but she seemed distant. She kept touching her hair, as if afraid someone would yank it again. My chest tightened every time I noticed that small gesture. Late afternoon, the doorbell rang. I braced myself for another confrontational visit from Karen, but to my relief it was Mrs. Henderson. She clutched a plate of homemade cookies and wore a sympathetic smile. "I just wanted to let you know I spoke to an officer this morning," she said. "I confirmed that was definitely Karen in my security footage, and I mentioned I saw your daughter crying out when Karen grabbed her." I thanked her for her kindness, touched that she'd gone out of her way to back us up officially. "We need more neighbors like you," Dad said, giving her a warm nod. The next day, the police decided to file charges for misdemeanor assault. We were told that Karen would receive a summons. Dad and I quietly celebrated the fact that the justice system was taking a step in the right direction. That evening, though, as we sat down to dinner, the doorbell rang again. This time I found a different neighbor, Mark, shifting from foot to foot on the porch. He looked uneasy. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, "but I heard from a board member that Karen's calling an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night. She's going to try to rally folks to remove your ramp and claim it's lowering property values. I thought you should know." My stomach clenched. "Thanks for the warning," I said, feeling a new wave of frustration. Dad had said the ADA protected us. But if the entire HOA board sided with Karen, they might make our lives miserable with daily fines or legal threats. When I told Dad, he frowned. "I've seen this tactic before. Discredit the victim to make them look like the aggressor. She's hoping to overshadow the assault charge with her own allegations." Sarah overheard from the living room. "Dad," she asked softly, "are they going to make us move?" My heart broke at the worry in her voice. I knelt by her wheelchair. "Absolutely not," I said, my tone as firm as I could manage. "We're not going anywhere. We have rights and we'll fight for them." The following evening, Dad, Teresa, and I headed to the community clubhouse where the emergency HOA meeting was set to take place. Sarah stayed home with a babysitter because I didn't want her to be subjected to more of Karen's venom. By the time we arrived, a surprising number of neighbors had shown up. It seemed everyone had heard the gossip. Karen stood at the front, wearing a bright red blazer, her lips pinched in annoyance when she saw me and Dad enter. The HOA president, a man named Gerald, called the meeting to order. Karen immediately launched into a rant about homeowners' rights and the detrimental impact of unsightly ramps and medical equipment on property values. She peppered her speech with pointed references to a family that had taken advantage of the community's goodwill. I wanted to scream that she was the one who had yanked my daughter's hair, but I forced myself to wait. When Karen finished speaking, Gerald opened the floor for discussion. Dad nudged me. I rose from my seat and stepped forward. "My name is Andrew Collins," I said, voice echoing in the mostly quiet hall. "My wife Teresa and I live on Rosewood Lane. We have a daughter named Sarah who is disabled and requires a wheelchair ramp for safe accessibility. This is not an eyesore, it's a necessity, and the ADA states that a person with a disability has the right to reasonable accommodations. Our ramp is one such accommodation." Karen rolled her eyes. "You can say what you like, but the bylaws are very clear about altering the exterior of your property without approval, and your ramp extends onto the sidewalk sometimes, which is community property." Dad stood up then, holding up his badge for everyone to see. A few people in the crowd gasped or whispered in surprise. "My name is Lieutenant James Collins, retired from the Sheriff's Department," he said calmly. "I have some relevant legal knowledge, so let me clarify. Federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, supersedes any local HOA bylaws when it comes to providing necessary accessibility. Attempting to penalize or remove that ramp could place this HOA in violation of federal regulations. Moreover, I'm here to address a far more serious matter. Miss Karen here stands accused of assaulting my granddaughter by pulling her hair. We have video footage, and the police have filed charges. A hush fell over the room. Karen flushed a deep shade of crimson, but her eyes gleamed with spite. "That's an ongoing investigation," she snapped. "You can't just smear my name in front of everyone. And anyway, you can't prove that silly ramp is protected if it's not installed properly. My fiancé's a property developer, and he said it's definitely not up to code." Someone in the back muttered something about how petty this was. Gerald looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. I noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Karen obviously hadn't told him about the assault charges. Dad cleared his throat. "We're prepared to show the security footage to anyone on this board who doubts our claim. And Andrew's attorneys are more than willing to discuss the legal ramifications of forcibly removing a critical accessibility feature. Are you sure you want to proceed with your claim that the ramp is a violation?" Karen tried to say something, but Gerald raised a shaky hand. "Ms. Karen," he said in a low voice, "I think we need to table the issue of the ramp until we consult our legal counsel. This is clearly more complicated than standard bylaw enforcement." The tension in the room was palpable. Karen looked betrayed, as though the board president had stabbed her in the back. She opened her mouth to protest, but Gerald added quickly, "And given the allegations of assault, perhaps we should refrain from any official HOA action until the matter is resolved with the police. We don't want the association entangled in a criminal investigation." A chorus of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors looked shocked, others relieved. A few clearly sided with Karen, but the majority seemed appalled that she had stooped to physically harming a disabled child. One voice rose above the rest. "Mark, the neighbor who had warned us, I'd like to say something," he announced. "I live down the street from Andrew and Teresa. Their daughter Sarah is sweet, never a nuisance, and that ramp hasn't inconvenienced me once. I think it's pretty disturbing that anyone would try to get rid of a child's only means of safe movement outside her home." A few people nodded in agreement. Karen's cheeks puffed in anger, and she pointed at Mark as though he'd committed treason. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she spat. "If we let one person break the rules, everyone else will do it too. Next thing you know, people will be installing giant sheds or painting their houses bright pink." Someone laughed nervously, but it only fueled Karen's rage. Gerald hammered his gavel lightly, asking for order, though his voice shook. "Let's calm down," he pleaded. "We can't make any final decisions tonight under these circumstances. I move to close the meeting." Karen practically lunged for the microphone, but Gerald ended the session before she could speak further. As the crowd dispersed, a swirl of whispered conversations filled the room. Dad and I exchanged glances of relief. It looked like, for the time being, Karen's attempt to weaponize the HOA had been derailed. Outside, the three of us, Dad, Teresa, and I, huddled under one of the street lights in the clubhouse parking lot. I exhaled, trying to purge the tension from my chest. "That could have been worse," I muttered. Teresa nodded. "At least it didn't devolve into them voting to tear down Sarah's ramp." Dad placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "The fight isn't over," he said. "But we showed them we won't be intimidated. And with the assault charge pending, Karen might be forced to step down from any active role in the HOA." As if on cue, Karen emerged from the clubhouse, marched straight over, and jabbed a finger in Dad's direction. "Flash your badge all you want," she hissed. "You can't protect them forever." When the time is right, I'll make sure the entire board sees that ramp for what it is, an ugly extension that violates our community's aesthetic. And as for your granddaughter, maybe you should keep her at home if she can't handle the real world." My blood boiled at that comment, but before I could respond, Dad gave Karen a look so cold it could have frozen lava. "You lay a finger on Sarah again," he said, voice eerily calm, "and you'll regret it more than you already do. Am I clear?" Karen's eyes flicked to the badge on his belt, and for the first time I saw a flash of fear behind her anger. Without another word, she stomped off to her car. We returned home, our nerves frayed. Sarah was already in bed, but the babysitter whispered that she'd had trouble falling asleep. The next morning, Teresa and I found her curled up with her stuffed dog, a worried expression etched on her face, even in sleep. It broke my heart that she felt so unsafe. Dad brewed some coffee, and we discussed the path forward. "Let's keep gathering all the documentation we can," he advised. "The HOA might send more violation notices, but that can end up looking like harassment if we show a pattern. I'm guessing we might need a lawyer soon." Sure enough, over the next week, 3 separate notices arrived by mail, each citing a different obscure bylaw about property modifications. One even listed the improper color of wheelchair ramp. The ramp was a neutral gray, so that just proved how absurd Karen's claims had become. Meanwhile, the wheels of justice turned slowly. Karen was due to appear for a hearing related to the assault charge. We had provided the security footage to the DA, along with statements from Sarah and Mrs. Henderson. According to the DA's office, if convicted, Karen could face fines or possibly jail time, though unlikely for a first offense. But it was still a black mark on her record, and I clung to that hope, wanting her to realize there were consequences for terrorizing a disabled child. Before the hearing date, however, we received a surprising phone call from an attorney representing the HOA itself. The board, minus Karen, had held an internal meeting to discuss how best to handle the fiasco. The attorney asked if we'd be willing to show him the security footage and share any documentation we had about the alleged harassment. We agreed. The next day he came by, a polished man in a suit, who introduced himself as Mr. Landon. He was cordial, clearly trying to minimize the HOA's liability. "Karen may have overstepped," he said diplomatically. "We'd like to avoid a larger scandal. Possibly we can come to an arrangement that satisfies everyone without involving too much litigation." Dad, who was present, gave Mr. Landon a steely glance. "We're not going to drop the charges if that's what you're implying," he said. Mr. Landon shook his head. "I'm not asking you to, but if we can show that the HOA is not complicit, that Ms. Karen was acting on her own, maybe we can all come out of this with minimal damage. Our board is prepared to issue a formal apology for the ramp violations if you agree not to sue the association as a whole. Obviously, Ms. Karen will face her legal issues personally." Teresa and I exchanged a look. We hadn't planned on suing the entire HOA, only fighting Karen's vendetta. Dad sipped his coffee, silent. "We'll consider it," I said carefully. "But the first priority is ensuring that our daughter is never harassed again, that her ramp remains untouched, and that Karen doesn't have a position of authority." Mr. Landon nodded, scribbling notes. "Understood. I believe the board is inclined to remove Ms. Karen from her post once the hearing is concluded. They just want to handle it quietly." Sure enough, word spread through the neighborhood that Karen's star was fading. The day before the hearing, I noticed someone hammering a "for sale" sign into Karen's front yard. She was standing there, arms folded, glaring at the worker as though it was all his fault. Part of me felt a small pang of relief at the thought she might move away, but I tried not to celebrate prematurely. bullies don't always retreat quietly. On the morning of the hearing, Dad and I accompanied Sarah to the courthouse. She was nervous, clutching my hand in her lap as we waited to be called. Karen arrived with an attorney, wearing a stiff blazer and an expression of barely concealed fury. Before the hearing began, her lawyer approached us with an offer. If we agreed to drop the charges, Karen would pay for Sarah's therapy or any other accommodations we deemed necessary, including modifications to our home side. I looked at Sarah, who was listening intently, then at Dad, who seemed unimpressed. "This isn't about money," I said firmly. "It's about the fact that you hurt my child. We want justice." The lawyer sighed. "My client is prepared to fight in court. The footage is inconclusive, and she'll testify it was accidental." Dad shook his head. "We'll let a judge decide." The hearing was short but intense. The prosecutor played the security footage on a small monitor. Even though the angle wasn't perfect, it clearly showed Karen's hand tugging on Sarah's hair. Karen's lawyer argued the same old story about the watch catching. Sarah was asked to speak briefly, which was heartbreaking to watch because she had to recall the details of being grabbed. Her voice wavered, but she bravely recounted that Karen had approached her from behind, yanked her hair, and hissed something about blocking the sidewalk. The judge took a short recess, then returned with a decision. There was enough evidence to proceed to trial if we wished, or we could accept a plea deal if one was offered. Karen and her lawyer huddled, and she glared at us. Soon the lawyer informed the judge they would consider a plea to a lesser charge, possibly battery or some form of misconduct that wouldn't result in a heavy sentence but would require probation and anger management classes. I glanced at Dad, who nodded. We conferred with the prosecutor. We didn't want to drag Sarah through a long trial, so if Karen was going to plead guilty and accept some form of punishment, that might be enough. The judge scheduled another hearing for official sentencing. Outside the courtroom, Karen shot us a look of pure hatred, but said nothing. Her attorney hovered close, probably telling her to keep quiet to avoid more trouble. A few days later, the HOA board held a special meeting. Dad and I attended as observers. Gerald, the president, stood up and announced that Karen was stepping down from her position. Her seat would remain vacant until the next election. He also read a statement apologizing for any distress caused to my family by misguided application of bylaw enforcement. The entire atmosphere felt like a hush of relief, as though a storm had finally passed. Some neighbors even applauded politely when he finished reading. Others, presumably Karen's allies, remained stone-faced. We returned home to find a typed letter on our doorstep from Mr. Landon, the HOA attorney, confirming the board's decision not to pursue any further action against our ramp. They recognized our daughter's right to accessible living. The letter also hinted that if we had any future concerns, we could contact him directly. It was as close to a formal apology as we were likely to get. Dad exhaled a satisfied breath. "That's progress," he said, then added grimly, "At least they're trying to distance themselves from Karen." By the time Karen's sentencing date arrived, rumors circulated that she and her fiancé had decided to leave the neighborhood altogether. At the courthouse, we saw them, with suitcases in the trunk of their SUV, presumably packed for a move. The plea agreement was formalized. Karen would serve community service hours, attend anger management, and remain on probation for a set period. No contact order with Sarah was also established, meaning she couldn't approach our daughter without risking immediate legal consequences. She looked humiliated as the judge pronounced the terms. Her fiancé scowled at us, but Dad and I stood firm, Sarah at our side, feeling a sense of closure. Once the ordeal ended, I noticed an immediate change in Sarah's demeanor. No longer did she flinch at every unexpected sound. She started using the sidewalk again with cautious optimism, and her nightmares gradually subsided. Teresa and I were still wary. Trauma doesn't vanish overnight, but we felt safer knowing Karen's harassment was now legally constrained. Dad stayed around for another week, just to ensure everything settled. On his last day in town, he took Sarah out for ice cream, rolling alongside her wheelchair and sharing stories from his career in law enforcement. I watched from the window as they returned, Sarah laughing at some anecdote he told. My heart brimmed with gratitude. Dad had been the pillar we needed, the authority figure who had the know-how and the badge to ensure the system took us seriously. Life resumed a normal rhythm after that. The new HOA stance was notably calmer, with no more petty fines or threatening notices. Occasionally, neighbors would stop by and offer supportive words, or gently ask for details about how we made Karen face consequences. Each time, I emphasized that we'd only stood up for our daughter's rights. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about ensuring she felt safe and respected in her own community. A few months later, as I wheeled Sarah down the sidewalk, our ramp proudly in place, she said, "Dad, I'm glad Grandpa helped us." I smiled, remembering how unstoppable Dad had looked the moment he showed his badge. "I am too," I replied, ruffling her hair gently. "That's what family is for, standing up for each other." Sarah fell silent for a moment. Then she added, "Maybe someday I can help people too, like he does." My heart squeezed with pride. "I have no doubt you will," I told her. "You're the bravest kid I know." Sunlight spilled over the houses, illuminating our quiet street. Despite all the turmoil, this was still our home. I recalled Karen's words about disabled children not belonging in a certain kind of pristine neighborhood. She had been wrong, so very wrong. Sarah did belong here. All that was needed was a community willing to adapt and be kind. The world had enough cruelty without adding trivial rules or power-hungry personalities trying to shape it into their narrow vision. If my father's unwavering support and that piece of incriminating security footage taught me anything, it was that injustice thrives when people assume no one will stand against it. Once we decided not to be silent, it all unraveled for Karen.